What if the most iconic ghost town of the gold rush wasn't built to fail, but to last forever? What if, for a brief and violent moment, Bodie truly believed it would outlive every other city in the American West? In the late 1870s, Bodie was not a ruin. It was a promise. Hidden high in the mountains of eastern California, over 8,000 feet above sea level, Bodie exploded into existence almost overnight after rich veins of gold were discovered nearby. What followed was not slow growth, but a violent surge. Thousands of men arrived within months, dragging entire lives behind them. Tools, families, addictions, and desperation. Tents became shacks. Shacks became buildings. Buildings became a city that refused to sleep. At its peak, Bodie held nearly 10,000 people. It had banks, newspapers, hotels, churches, schools, saloons, brothels, and one of the most advanced mining operations in the region. Money moved fast. Too fast. Fortunes were made and lost in days, sometimes hours. And with that speed came something darker, an atmosphere where rules lagged behind ambition. Bodie was isolated, brutally cold in winter, scorched by sun in summer, and constantly battered by wind. But isolation didn't slow it down. It sharpened it. This was a place where survival demanded aggression, where hesitation meant poverty, and where violence became routine. Contemporary accounts describe Bodie as a town where gunshots were so common they barely turned heads. Murders happened in daylight. Fights ended in graves. And yet people stayed. Why? Because Bodie wasn't just a mining camp. It was an idea. The idea that gold could rewrite your identity. That a nobody could arrive with nothing and leave powerful, or at least richer than before. Newspapers of the time spoke of Bodie as unstoppable, a city destined to dominate the region. Investors poured in, infrastructure expanded. The belief was clear: Bodie wasn't temporary, Bodie was the future. But beneath that confidence was a constant tension. The gold was real, but finite. The mines went deeper, more dangerous, more expensive. Accidents increased. Cave-ins buried men alive. Machinery failures crushed bodies without warning. Still, production continued. The city pushed forward, as if momentum alone could protect it. Families tried to normalize life amid the chaos. Children walked past saloons on their way to school. Churches held sermons while gunfights echoed nearby. Women ran businesses, raised families, and endured a town where death was never abstract. It was visible, frequent, and personal. Bodie functioned, but barely. It was held together by gold, alcohol, and denial. What's unsettling is how confident the town remained, even as cracks formed. Bodie expanded when it should have paused. It celebrated when it should have prepared. It assumed tomorrow would always be richer than today. And that belief shaped every decision, from reckless spending to unchecked violence. This is what makes Bodie different from countless failed mining towns. It didn't see itself as temporary. It didn't act like a gamble. It behaved like a permanent city, one that believed history would bend around it. And that belief, more than the gold, more than the guns, set the stage for everything that followed. Because when a city is built on certainty instead of caution, it doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, quietly, invisibly. And by the time people realize what's happening, the future they were chasing is already gone. Before we move forward into the blood, the fires, and the silence that would eventually consume Bodie, I want to know something. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment to pause and reflect on what Bodie really represents. This wasn't just a town chasing gold. It was a place where ambition moved faster than caution, and where people believed the future was guaranteed simply because money was flowing. I'd really like to hear your thoughts right now. Do you think Bodie was doomed from the very beginning? Or do you believe it could have survived if different choices had been made? Leave a comment sharing your theory, or even just one word that describes how this story makes you feel so far. And if you're finding value in this deep dive into forgotten cities, hidden violence, and the darker side of history, make sure you understand how important that support is. Hitting the like button tells the platform this kind of content matters. Subscribing ensures you don't miss what comes next, because the story of Bodie is only getting darker from here. By the time Bodie reached its peak, the gold was no longer just beneath the ground. It was in the air, in the way people spoke, in the way they looked at each other, and most of all, in the way they acted. This was not a town governed by patience or restraint. It was a place where wealth arrived suddenly, unevenly, and without warning, and where violence followed the same pattern. Bodie earned a reputation that spread far, beyond California. Newspapers described it as one of the most dangerous towns in the American West. Not because crime existed everywhere on the frontier, but because in Bodie, it became normal. Shootings were not shocking events. They were background noise. Men argued over cards, drinks, debts, or claims, and arguments ended quickly. A hand reached for a gun. Someone fell. Life moved on. What made Bodie especially volatile was the absence of meaningful authority. Law enforcement existed in name, but not in power. Sheriffs came and went, often outnumbered, sometimes corrupt, sometimes simply overwhelmed. The city grew faster than any system meant to control it. When thousands of miners poured in within months, there were no structures in place to absorb that pressure. No shared code, no stable hierarchy, only opportunity and fear of losing it. Gold intensified everything. A miner could strike it rich in the morning and be broke by nightfall. Saloons lined the streets, offering alcohol strong enough to erase judgment and amplify rage. Gambling halls operated day and night. Brothels flourished, bringing money and tension in equal measure. Every corner of Bodie was a collision point between desperation and excess. Violence wasn't just random, it was functional. It resolved disputes faster than courts ever could. It established dominance. It protected claims. In Bodie, being feared was often safer than being respected. Men carried weapons openly, not as symbols, but as necessities. To be unarmed was to announce vulnerability. Yet the most unsettling part wasn't the killings themselves. It was how quickly they faded from memory. A man could die in the street and be forgotten within days, replaced by another arrival, chasing the same promise. Graves filled the hillside, many unmarked, as the living refused to slow down long enough to mourn properly. Death became transactional, another cost of doing business. Children grew up surrounded by this reality. Accounts from the time describe boys learning to shoot before they learned to read, girls navigating streets filled with drunk men and open hostility. Parents tried to impose normalcy, school schedules, church attendance, but the environment eroded those efforts. Bodie didn't nurture innocence, it consumed it. Ironically, the wealth flowing through the town made the violence worse, not better. Money created stakes too high to negotiate calmly. Every disagreement carried the weight of potential, fortune or ruin. Every claim dispute threatened livelihoods. Every insult felt existential. And because Bodie believed itself permanent, there was no urgency to reform. No sense that restraint was necessary for survival. This culture of violence didn't scare people away at first. It attracted them. For many, Bodie represented freedom from rules they never trusted to begin with. A place where strength mattered more than pedigree. Where luck could overturn hierarchy overnight. Where consequences felt distant, abstract, until suddenly they weren't. But cultures built on aggression have limits. They burn energy fast. They exhaust communities. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they hollow out the structures they depend on. Bodie kept growing on the surface, but beneath that expansion something unstable was forming, a pressure that no amount of gold could fully contain. Living in Bodie meant waking up every morning knowing that stability was an illusion. There was no clear separation. between danger and routine, between survival and collapse. The same streets that echoed with laughter at night could carry bodies by morning. And yet people built lives there anyway, fragile, improvised lives, held together by habit and necessity. For families, daily existence required a constant negotiation with fear. Children walked to school past saloons already crowded before noon, stepping around broken bottles, listening to arguments that could turn violent without warning. Teachers tried to enforce discipline inside classrooms, while gunshots sometimes cracked through the walls from somewhere down the street. Lessons continued. Attendance was irregular. Education existed, but it competed with chaos for attention. Homes in Bodie were functional, not comfortable. Hastily built wooden structures offered little protection from the mountain cold. Winters were brutal. Snow buried streets. Wind cut through walls as if they weren't there. Fuel was expensive, and fires were kept low to conserve wood, even as temperatures dropped far below freezing. Illness spread easily. Pneumonia, influenza, infections. Medical care lagged far behind the population's needs. Women carried a disproportionate burden. Many ran boarding houses, laundries, small shops, or worked in saloons not by choice, but because those were the few options available. Raising children in Bodie meant constant vigilance. Doors were locked early, windows were shuttered. Mothers listened for footsteps outside at night, unsure whether the sounds meant a drunk miner or something worse. Men lived under a different pressure. Mining was relentless, dangerous, and unforgiving. Shifts lasted long hours underground, where cave-ins, gas pockets, and equipment failures were common. Injuries were frequent. Deaths were accepted as part of the work. A man might leave home in the morning and simply never return. When that happened, life didn't pause. Someone else took his place. Despite this, Bodie tried to look like a real city. Newspapers were printed daily, filled with advertisements, crime reports, and optimistic forecasts about mining output. Churches held services, preaching morality in a town that rarely practiced it. Social events were organized, dances, gatherings, celebrations, brief attempts to impose order and meaning on a place that resisted both. Alcohol flowed constantly, not just as recreation, but as anesthetic. It dulled fear. It softened grief. It blurred the edges of regret. Gambling offered another escape. Card tables stayed busy day and night, as men tried to turn exhaustion and luck into quick salvation. Losses were shrugged off with forced bravado. Wins were celebrated loudly, and often briefly. What's striking is how normalized all of this became. Residents adapted. They learned when to avoid certain streets. They memorized which saloons were safest, which men were most dangerous, which arguments were worth walking away from. Bodie developed its own informal survival code, passed quietly from one person to another, but normalization came at a cost. When violence becomes background noise, warning signs stop triggering alarms. When instability feels permanent, preparation feels pointless. People stop asking how long this can last, and start assuming it always will. That assumption shaped every choice Bodie made next. And it explains why, when the first signs of decline appeared, most people didn't recognize them for what they were. They were too busy surviving, today to question tomorrow. Bodie did not collapse with a single explosion or a dramatic moment of realization. It began to fail the way most human systems fail, quietly, unevenly, and in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. On the surface, the town still looked alive. Lights burned at night, saloons stayed open, the mines kept running. But underneath that familiar rhythm, the foundation was starting to give way. The first warning signs came from the mines themselves. The richest veins of gold, the ones that had justified Bodie's explosive growth, were becoming harder to reach. Digging deeper meant higher costs, more complex machinery, and greater risk. Accidents increased. Returns became less predictable. Some days yielded nothing at all. Investors noticed, even if the town didn't want to. Capital began to move differently. Money that once poured into Bodie with enthusiasm started to hesitate. Outside investors quietly shifted their attention to newer discoveries elsewhere. Nevada, Colorado, Alaska, fresh promises with fewer complications. Bodie was still producing gold, but it was no longer exciting. And in the gold rush economy, excitement mattered as much as output. Population numbers began to fluctuate. Not dramatically at first. A few families left. Some single miners moved on after a bad run of luck. Boarding houses had empty rooms more often. Shops closed a day or two earlier than usual. These changes didn't feel alarming. Frontier towns were used to movement. People came and went all the time. What made the decline dangerous was how invisible it felt to those inside it. Bodie had survived violence, weather, isolation, and lawlessness. Compared to those threats, a slow economic shift seemed manageable. There was a belief, deeply ingrained by years of momentum, that things would turn around, that the next vein, the next investment, the next season would restore the balance. But optimism masked structural problems. The town was expensive to sustain. Supplies had to be hauled in over long distances. Equipment maintenance costs rose as machines aged and worked harder for diminishing returns. Wages became harder to pay consistently. Disputes over claims increased as competition intensified around shrinking resources. Social tension followed. When money flows freely, violence feels impulsive. When money tightens, violence becomes desperate. Arguments grew sharper, theft increased, trust eroded. The informal survival code that once kept Bodie functional began to fray as fear replaced confidence. Even the weather seemed less forgiving. Harsh winters isolated the town for longer stretches. Supply shortages lasted longer. Repairs took more time. Each delay amplified frustration. Each problem fed the sense that Bodie was becoming harder to live in, not easier. Yet, most people stayed. They had too much invested, financially, emotionally, psychologically, to leave easily. Admitting Bodie was declining meant admitting that years of risk, violence, and sacrifice might not pay off. It was easier to believe the downturn was temporary than to accept that the future was already slipping away. This denial slowed adaptation. Instead of preparing for contraction, Bodie tried to maintain its peak. Instead of planning exits, people doubled down. The town continued to behave like a rising city long after it had stopped rising, and that refusal to acknowledge reality made what came next far more destructive than it needed to be. When Bodie finally began to empty, it did not happen with panic or mass evacuation. It happened through loss, through damage that felt manageable at first, then irreversible, and nothing accelerated that process more than fire. Fire was always Bodie's quiet enemy. The town was built almost entirely of wood, dry, weather-beaten, tightly packed structures designed for speed, not safety. Open flames burned everywhere, stoves, lamps, heaters, candles. In a place where wind howled constantly through narrow streets, a single spark could travel faster than fear. The first major fires struck when Bodie was already weakened. Businesses were operating on thinner margins. Repairs were delayed. Insurance, when it existed at all, rarely covered full losses. When buildings burned, many owners simply did not rebuild. What had once been temporary damage became permanent absence. Entire blocks vanished. Hotels, boarding houses, saloons, places that had once pulsed with noise and movement, collapsed into ash. Each fire carved another hole into the city's structure, breaking continuity and morale. Streets that once connected neighborhoods now ended in ruins. The city became fragmented, uneven, quieter. People began leaving, not because they were forced to, but because staying stopped making sense. Jobs disappeared as mines closed or reduced operations. Schools struggled to stay open as families moved away. Churches lost congregations. Services failed one by one. The social fabric unraveled. Slowly, giving the illusion that there was still time to fix things. Some departures were sudden. Families left belongings behind, assuming they would return once conditions improved. Dishes stayed on tables. Furniture remained in place. Personal items were locked inside homes that would never be opened again. Others left deliberately, selling what little they could, boarding wagons or trains toward uncertain futures elsewhere. By the time Bodie realized it was dying, the momentum had reversed. The city no longer pulled people in, it pushed them out. Fires continued to claim what abandonment spared. Without enough residents to respond quickly, small blazes became devastating. Structures weakened by neglect collapsed under snow and wind. What remained was eerie, a town that looked paused rather than destroyed. Buildings still stood, streets were still visible, interiors still held traces of daily life. But there was no movement, no voices, no purpose. Time seemed to hesitate there, unsure whether to advance or retreat. This is why Bodie feels different from other abandoned places. It wasn't erased. It was interrupted, left mid-sentence. A city caught between ambition and surrender, preserved not by intention at first, but by neglect and isolation. And as the years passed, something else began to form around Bodie's remains, a narrative. Stories about why it was left untouched, stories about consequences, stories that warned people not to disturb what was left behind. Because Bodie was no longer just a failed city. It was becoming something symbolic, a place people approached carefully, quietly, almost respectfully. Bodie did not fall apart in a single moment. It drained away, slowly, quietly, almost politely. By the early decades of the 20th century, the town was no longer fighting to survive. It was simply letting go. What makes this phase unsettling is not what happened, but how little noise it made while happening. There were no sirens, no final announcement, no official declaration that Bodie was finished. People just stopped coming back. The exodus unfolded in patterns that were easy to overlook. One mine shut down permanently, another reduced shifts. A boarding house owner left after failing to fill rooms for an entire winter. A teacher closed a classroom when there were no longer enough children to justify it. Each departure felt isolated. Together they hollowed the town from the inside. Those who stayed longest were often the ones with the least ability to leave. Elderly residents, families without savings, men who had gambled everything on claims that never paid off. They watched familiar faces disappear one by one, storefronts darken, and streets grow quieter with each passing season. Winter accelerated the process. Snow cut off supply routes for weeks at a time. With fewer people maintaining roads and buildings, storms caused more damage than before. Roofs collapsed, windows shattered, repairs didn't happen. What would once have been a temporary setback now became permanent decay. Mail service became unreliable, deliveries slowed. Medical help was farther away than ever. For many, the decision to leave wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Staying meant isolation without reward. Leaving meant uncertainty, but at least the possibility of a future. Some residents packed carefully, taking what they could carry and locking doors behind them. Others left abruptly, assuming the town might rebound and they would return. Those returns rarely happened. Years passed. Seasons erased footprints. Memories faded elsewhere, but Bodie remained unchanged. As population numbers dropped into the dozens, the town lost its ability to function as a community. There were no longer enough people to sustain shared norms or responsibilities. Fires burned longer before being noticed. Theft went unchallenged. Wind and weather did more damage than humans ever had. Eventually, Bodie crossed an invisible threshold. It stopped being a place people lived and became a place people remembered or tried to forget. And in that silence, something strange occurred. The absence itself became heavy. Visitors who passed through later described an unnatural stillness, as if the town were holding its breath. Doors creaked. Objects remained where they were last touched. Dust settled evenly, undisturbed. This silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged. Bodie felt unfinished, like a story abandoned mid-thought, and that unfinished. Quality invited interpretation, imagination, and eventually, fear. Because when people encounter places emptied without explanation, they search for meaning. They invent reasons. They assign warnings. And slowly, Bodie began to acquire a reputation that went beyond history. As Bodie slipped fully into silence, something unexpected began to take its place. Not people, not industry, but belief. Stories started to circulate, quietly at first, then with growing certainty, that Bodie did not like to be disturbed. That the town left behind so abruptly carried something with it, something that followed those who took pieces of it away. The so-called curse of Bodie did not emerge from a single dramatic incident. It formed gradually, through accumulation. Visitors pocketed small objects, an old nail, a bottle, a piece of pottery, a spoon, from abandoned homes and streets. At first, it felt harmless. Bodie was empty. Who would miss it? But then letters began arriving. They came to park rangers, local museums, and later to the California State Parks offices. Envelopes containing stolen items, mailed back anonymously or with handwritten confessions. Notes described sudden illness, financial ruin, accidents, failed marriages, deaths in the family. The message was consistent. Please put this back. Ever since I took it, everything went wrong. Some letters were emotional, others factual, almost clinical. People described car crashes shortly after leaving Bodie, businesses collapsing within months, loved ones falling sick unexpectedly. One letter reportedly included a wedding ring taken from a house, returned after the marriage ended in divorce and tragedy. Another described a child's unexplained illness that began days after a souvenir was taken. Skeptics dismiss these stories as coincidence or guilt, manifesting as superstition. But the sheer volume unsettles even the rational mind. Hundreds of returned objects now sit in storage, catalogued not as artifacts, but as apologies, each one tied to a story of regret. What makes Bodie's curse unique is its tone. It isn't vengeful in a dramatic sense. There are no tales of ghosts attacking intruders or voices screaming in the night. Instead, the curse is described as subtle, slow, persistent, like bad luck that refuses to lift. As if Bodie doesn't punish, it reminds. Psychologists might argue that the curse functions as a moral mechanism. Taking from Bodie violates an unspoken rule, and guilt seeks expression. But that explanation doesn't fully account for the consistency of the experiences, or the fear they inspire in people who claim they didn't believe in the curse at all. Park rangers now actively warn visitors. Take photographs, not objects. Signs are posted. Guides repeat the warning with a half-smile that feels practiced, but serious. And still, items go missing. And still, some of them return. The legend has become self-reinforcing. The more it's told, the more powerful it feels. Bodie transforms. From a historical site into a boundary, between respect and intrusion, memory and theft. The town becomes not just abandoned, but guarded in an invisible way. And perhaps that's the most unsettling idea of all. That Bodie, stripped of people, law and purpose, still enforces a kind of order. That it demands something from those who enter, acknowledgement, restraint, respect. Because once a place absorbs enough human ambition, violence, loss, and abandonment, maybe it doesn't need anyone living there to make its presence felt. When Bodie emptied, it didn't leave behind a clear record of where everyone went. There was no final census, no coordinated relocation, no single destination that absorbed the town's former population. Instead, the people of Bodie scattered, quietly, unevenly, into the vast anonymity of the American West. And that scattering is part of what makes Bodie feel unresolved even today. Some residents followed the gold. This was the most predictable path. As new strikes appeared in Nevada, Colorado, and later Alaska, former Bodie miners reappeared in payroll lists, claim records, and newspaper mentions hundreds of miles away. A few struck luck again. Many didn't. Their names surface briefly in other boomtowns, then disappear entirely, swallowed by the same cycle that had once lifted them. Families took different routes. Some moved to established cities like San Francisco or Sacramento, hoping to trade volatility for stability. Census records show former Bodie residents working as laborers, shopkeepers, clerks, lives quieter and smaller than the ones they had imagined during the gold rush. For many, Bodie remained the peak, not the beginning. But there are gaps, significant ones. Children who vanish from records, men whose names appear on mining rosters and then nowhere else, women listed once in boarding house logs and never again. In an era with weak documentation, especially for transient workers, disappearance didn't always mean death, but it often meant erasure. Without property, family ties, or formal employment, people could fade completely from history. Some likely died shortly after leaving. Mining-related illnesses, untreated injuries, alcoholism, and exposure took their toll. Frontier medicine offered little protection. Grave markers in nearby towns list unfamiliar names with no birth dates, only death years. It's impossible to know how many of those belong to people who once called Bodie home. Others may have stayed longer than expected. Records suggest a small number of residents remained well into the 20th century, clinging to familiarity even as the town emptied around them. These were not dreamers anymore. They were caretakers of a dying place, living among collapsing buildings and fading memories until Bodie became uninhabitable even for them. What's unsettling is how little closure there is. Bodie didn't just lose its people, it lost their stories. Unlike cities destroyed by war or disaster, there was no defining moment to anchor memory, no single tragedy to memorialize, just absence. And absence is harder to process. This lack of resolution fuels the unease visitors feel today. When you walk through Bodie, you aren't just seeing abandoned buildings, you're encountering unanswered questions. Who slept in that bed last? Who wrote that note? Who stood at that window knowing they were leaving for the final time? Bodie's people didn't vanish together. They dissolved into history one by one. And, because of that, the town never truly feels finished. It feels interrupted, as if the story paused, waiting for voices that never returned. Bodie didn't become famous because it vanished completely. It became famous because it refused to disappear in the normal way. Most boomtowns collapse, get stripped for lumber, swallowed by weeds, bulldozed, rebuilt, repurposed, or simply erased by development. Bodie did something stranger. It stayed standing long enough for the outside world to decide it was worth freezing in place, like a crime scene no one is allowed to clean. For years after the last meaningful wave of residents left, Bodie sat exposed to the most patient forces on Earth: wind, snow, sun, dryness, and time. Roofs sagged, glass shattered, wood cracked and bleached, paper curled into brittle shapes in drawers and on shelves. And at first, no one called it preservation. It was just abandonment with a long delay before the final collapse. Then the attention arrived, slowly, then all at once. Here's the first twist most people don't expect. Bodie's survival wasn't driven by love. It was driven by tension. On one side, there were people who saw Bodie as a resource to take from: boards, metal, fixtures, antiques, souvenirs. On the other, there were people who began to see Bodie as a warning, a rare, intact snapshot of the gold rush's aftermath. And once that second idea gains momentum, a ghost town stops being a ruin. It becomes evidence. At some point, authorities stepped in Bodie's identity changed. Not an empty town, but a protected place. The goal wasn't to restore it into something polished and comfortable. The goal was the opposite. Keep it decaying, but keep it there. That concept has a name people often repeat because it sounds almost clinical. Arrested decay. Not a museum makeover, not reconstruction, just stabilization. Holding the building in the exact stage of collapse it reached, like stopping a clock mid-tick. That decision creates a strange, psychological effect when you walk through Bodie. You don't feel like you're visiting history. You feel like you're interrupting it. There's still furniture in some rooms, bottles on shelves, rusting bed frames, school desks, wallpaper peeling like skin. And because the place is preserved with the mess intact, your brain keeps trying to complete the scene. You start imagining the last hand that touched each object, the last argument that happened in that doorway, the last winter when someone tried to keep that stove burning. But here's the second twist. The more Bodie is protected, the more it feels forbidden. Preservation creates boundaries, signs, patrols, rules, locked doors, and boundaries don't just control behavior. They create mythology. They amplify the feeling that something is being guarded. Even if what's being guarded is only wood, dust, and silence, the human mind turns protection into meaning. If they won't let me touch it, it must matter. And once something matters, people begin to believe it can react. This is where Bodie's official status and its curse begin feeding each other. The town becomes a place where theft isn't just illegal. It's treated like a violation. Take something, and you're not merely stealing. You're breaking an unspoken agreement with the dead. That's why the returned objects and apology letters hit so hard. They don't feel like guilt alone. They feel like a relationship between visitor and place, as if Bodie is a living boundary that punishes disrespect. Preservation also exposes another uncomfortable truth. Ghost towns aren't neutral. Choosing what to preserve is choosing what story gets told. Bodie can be framed as a romantic Old West relic, a tourist destination, a cinematic ruin. Or it can be framed as what it really was for many people. An extraction machine that chewed through bodies, families, and hope with industrial indifference. Some tours emphasize architecture and artifacts. Others emphasize violence and collapse. Both are real, but each version pulls your emotions in a different direction. And here comes the third twist, the one that makes Bodie feel like it's still alive in a disturbing way. Preservation doesn't stop decay. It only slows it, reshapes it, manages it. Wind still pushes through broken frames. Snow still stacks on weakened roofs. Wood still dries and splits. Dust still settles on the same objects year after year. The town is protected, but it's also continuing to, die, on schedule, in public, as an attraction. That's a haunting concept on its own. A place maintained specifically so you can watch it fade. So Bodie becomes two things at once, a historic site with rules and caretakers, and a psychological trap where the mind keeps asking questions it can't answer. Who left that bottle? Why is that child's shoe still there? What happened in that house when the money stopped? And why does the town feel like it's listening? Because once Bodie becomes official, it stops being just a story about the gold rush. It becomes a story about memory, about what we choose to keep, and about what refuses to stay buried. Now, if Bodie is preserved, documented, and protected, why does it still feel dangerous? Why do people leave with that same uneasy sensation, like the town followed them out? So why does Bodie still feel like it's breathing, even though it's been empty for generations? Why do people step through those streets and lower their voice without realizing it? Like the town can hear them. It's not just the wind. It's not just the creaking wood. It's not even the legends. Bodie is unsettling because it doesn't behave like a normal abandoned place. It behaves like a place that remembers. Most ghost towns are erased. They're dismantled, scavenged, flattened, repurposed. Body stayed intact long enough to become a kind of preserved interruption. Rooms still staged by accident, not by design. When your brain sees a chair positioned like someone might return to it, or a bottle left on a shelf like it was placed yesterday, it doesn't interpret that as history. It interprets it as unfinished. And unfinished stories are psychological traps. Your mind keeps trying to complete the last scene, and every time it fails, the unease grows. Here's a twist people rarely notice. Bodie isn't haunted by ghosts as much as it's haunted by economics. It's a city built on a single promise: gold. And when that promise weakened, everything else collapsed behind it. Safety, community, purpose, identity. That's why Bodie feels modern in a disturbing way. It's not just a Western relic. It's a blueprint for what happens when a place is built around extraction and belief instead of stability and care. The buildings are old, but the pattern is familiar. Surge, hype, violence, normalization, denial, slow departure, silence. And then there's the second twist. Bodie's reputation feeds on your own behavior. The curse story works because it targets something primitive: ownership. When someone takes an object from Bodie, it isn't just theft. It's an attempt to claim the town, to carry a piece of it like proof. I was there. But Bodie is a place that punishes ownership, not necessarily through supernatural force, through psychology. A stolen object becomes a constant reminder that you crossed a line, and once guilt finds a place to live, it spreads into every bad coincidence. A flat tire becomes a sign. A sudden argument becomes a warning. A random illness becomes a consequence. Whether you believe in curses or not, your mind is built to connect dots, especially when fear gives it permission. Now the third twist, maybe the darkest one, is this. Bodie doesn't scare people because it's empty. It scares people because it's organized emptiness. The streets still have shape. The buildings still have rooms. The schoolhouse still looks like it could hold voices. The church still looks like it could hold prayers. And when a place still looks capable of life but refuses to produce it, it triggers something deep. The sense that life was removed, not ended. That's the feeling that makes visitors say, "It's like everyone left yesterday." Not because that's true, but because the town holds the posture of a living place without the warmth of one. And there's another layer people don't like admitting. Bodie forces you to imagine what it felt like to realize the dream was dying while you were still inside it. To watch neighbors leave. To watch businesses fail. To watch winter turn harder, not because the weather changed, but because the town stopped being able to fight back. That's the quiet horror at the center of Bodie. Not the shootouts, not the fires, not the curse. Just the slow recognition that the future you built your identity around is evaporating. And there's nothing heroic about that moment. It's just cold, practical, silent. That's why Bodie still haunts. Because it isn't a story about a town that died. It's a story about a town that realized it was dying and kept going anyway. It's the afterimage of ambition, frozen in wood and dust. And when you stand there, you're not only looking at Bodie, you're looking at how quickly a place can become a memory while the furniture is still in the room. If you stayed to the end, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Someone who doesn't just skim a mystery, but follows it all the way down until the silence starts to feel personal. Now, do 3 quick things that genuinely help this kind of deep, story-driven history reach more people. First, subscribe. Bodie is only one case. There are other ghost towns with darker endings, stranger disappearances, and clues that never made it into the official story. And if you're here for this kind of atmosphere, you don't want to miss the next one. Second, hit like if this kept you watching. It's the simplest signal that tells the platform this content is worth pushing. Third, and most important, leave a comment so I can see how you interpreted the mystery. Comment this exact line. I would never take anything from Bodie. Then add your answer to this. Do you think Bodie feels haunted because of a real curse, because of human guilt, or because the town itself is a warning we don't want to hear? And before you go, watch the next video that's appearing on your screen right now, because the next ghost town we're stepping into doesn't just feel abandoned. It feels like it was emptied on purpose.